Welcome to this explainer on JP Morgan. Today we're diving into the absolutely wild history of how one man got his hands on so much wealth and influence, he basically became the de facto central bank of the United States. We're going to look at his methods, his controversies, and the massive legacy he left on modern finance. But to really grasp the sheer scale of his power, we actually need to start at the brink of a total economic collapse. Picture this. It's October 1907, and Wall Street is in absolute turmoil. A few major shareholders tried to corner the stock of the United Copper Company, and well, it failed miserably. This triggered a massive bank run. Panic spread like wildfire, and the stock market plummeted by nearly 50%. We're talking about an economic freefall here that literally threatened to wipe out the entire American financial system. So, with ruin staring them right in the face, you know what these desperate New York businessmen did? They didn't look to the federal government for a bailout. Nope. Instead, they all flocked to Madison Avenue. They went to beg a 70-year-old banker named J.P. Morgan to step in and single-handedly save the American economy from a full-scale crash. Which begs the question, how on earth did one private citizen wield so much power that the entire nation had to rely on him in a crisis? Section 1. The Making of a Titan, a Transatlantic Heir. Morgan, as you'll see, was not your typical rags to riches story. He was born right into an elite global banking empire. His father, Junius Spencer Morgan, meticulously groomed Pierpont for the world of finance. And the family built their immense capital by doing something highly controversial, capitalizing on wartime crises. Take the American Civil War, for instance. Pierpont financed the purchase of 5,000 obsolete rifles for $12.50 each, and then turned around and sold them right back to the Union Army for $22. He netted a tidy $26,000 profit on that alone. He also completely avoided the Civil War draft by legally paying a substitute $300 to take his place. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, his dad Junius was taking massive risks of his own, underwriting a £10 million bond for the French government during the Franco-Prussian War at a 6% interest rate. That move ultimately secured them a £1.5 million profit. So these bold and, highly controversial moves provided the massive capital the Morgans needed to expand their empire. Section 2. The Era of Morganization, Restoring Order. Now, that wartime capital became incredibly useful following the Panic of 1873. The American economy in the Gilded Age was frankly chaotic. This was especially true in the rapidly expanding railroad industry, which was just plagued by cutthroat, mutually destructive competition. It's really a tale of two economic styles. On one side, you had this chaotic Gilded Age capitalism, defined by wild bankruptcies, brutal price wars, and completely unpredictable swings. On the other side, you had Morgan's strict strategy for orderly trusts. See, he absolutely hated this instability. His ultimate goal was to enforce order and ensure reliable returns, especially to keep his conservative European investors happy. And the way he did this? By taking over failing firms and completely restructuring them from the ground up. He achieved this order through a signature move that literally became known as Morganization. Here's how it worked. He'd take over these bankrupt railroad companies, place their shares in voting trusts controlled by himself and his close associates, and then ruthlessly cut costs while eliminating competition to restore profitability. It was brutal, but effective. By the 1890s, this relentless consolidation gave Morgan effective control over 1/6 of the entire American railway network. And he didn't just buy out competitors. Sometimes he literally forced them to cooperate. There's this legendary story from 1885 known as the Corsair Agreement. Morgan famously cornered feuding executives from the New York Central and Pennsylvania railroads, getting them onto his private yacht, the Corsair. Once they were on board, he flat out refused to let them leave until they agreed to stop their destructive price war. I mean, talk about forceful, right? It was direct and it worked. Section 3. Creating American Behemoths, Industrial Consolidation. By stabilizing the railroads, Morgan's thirst for control moved right into the broader industrial sector. And this was heavily supported by a very pro-business political climate under President William McKinley. Just look at his formation of U.S. Steel in 1901. To prevent what would have been a ruinous price war, Morgan sat down with Charles Schwab and orchestrated a deal to just go ahead and buy out Andrew Carnegie's steel empire. The price tag? A staggering $480 million. He then took that and combined Carnegie's operations with John D. Rockefeller's mining interests. to create a single massive trust that totally dominated the market. To put the sheer scale of this move into perspective, U.S. Steel launched with a market capitalization of $1.4 billion. That's billion with a B. It instantly became the largest company on the stock market at the time, operating with economies of scale that no one had ever even imagined before. Section 4. The one-man central bank, a private lender of resort. With this unparalleled financial muscle, Morgan started stepping in to perform the duties of a government institution. Way before the Federal Reserve ever existed, he acted as a private lender of last resort. This immense power became absolutely critical during the 1895 gold crisis. At the time, United States Treasury gold reserves had plummeted below the critical $100 million mark, meaning the federal government was literally poised to default. So, what happens? Morgan actually barges right into President Grover Cleveland's office. He offers to gather 3.5 million ounces of gold in exchange for $65 million in 30-year bonds. He effectively manipulated international currency markets just to protect the gold standard, and his private bailout immediately calmed global markets. Which brings us right back to our starting point, the Panic of 1907. Over just a few frantic days, a 70-year-old J.P. Morgan acted as a one-man economic firefighter. Check this out. On October 21st, that copper crash triggers a run on trusts. Then, on October 23rd, Morgan deploys $3 million to save the Trust Company of America. The very next day, October 24th, he forces banks to put up $25 million to save failing brokerages. By the 28th, he actually bails out New York City itself with a $30 million lifeline. And finally, on November 2nd, he arranges for his own U.S. Steel to absorb a struggling competitor, Tennessee Coal, just to save a heavily indebted brokerage, finally halting the collapse. It's almost unbelievable. Section 5. The Monopoly Backlash, the Progressive Era. Morgan had saved the day, sure, but it came at a massive cost to public trust. The sheer unregulated power of one single man to dictate the survival of the American economy terrified the public, and it helped usher in the Progressive Era's antitrust movement. A massive ideological war broke out. On one side, you had Morgan, who deeply believed in consolidated trusts to maintain order and prosperity. But on the other side, politicians like President Theodore Roosevelt and later William Howard Taft believed these monopolies were a massive threat to a free economy. Roosevelt actually initiated proceedings to break up Morgan's railway holdings under the Sherman Antitrust Act, and he won a major Supreme Court victory against him in 1904. This antitrust sentiment eventually culminated in the 1912 Peugeot Committee hearings. The House Banking and Currency Committee, led by Arsène Peugeot, forced Morgan to travel down to Washington and publicly defend his outsized grip on Wall Street. Their goal? They wanted to prove that a small group of elite financiers, led by Morgan himself, maintained a dangerous monopoly over American credit. During these hearings, Morgan delivered this incredibly famous quote about how he decided who actually received credit. He said, "Because a man I do not trust could not get money from me on all the bonds in Christendom." I mean, that perfectly encapsulates his elite, paternalistic worldview. To Morgan, finance shouldn't be dictated by government regulation at all. It should be dictated by the personal character of the men sitting right across the desk from him. Section 6. The Morgan Legacy. End of an era. Morgan died in Rome in 1913, shortly after those hearings at the age of 76, leaving behind a massive footprint on global culture and modern finance. But, just before his death, he narrowly avoided a historic disaster. Among his many, many consolidations, Morgan had formed the International Mercantile Marine Company. This was a shipping trust that owned the White Star Line. Yes, the very creators of the RMS Titanic. Morgan actually attended the ship's christening and even had a personal suite reserved for its doomed 1912 maiden voyage. But fatefully, he canceled his reservation at the very last minute. The tragic loss of life deeply devastated him, and the disaster ultimately doomed his shipping trust, which disbanded shortly after in 1914. When we look at his lasting impact, it's almost too vast to measure. Culturally, he left behind a private art collection valued at $50 million, heavily boosting institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art and creating the Morgan Library. Financially, his name obviously lives on today in modern titans like J.P. Morgan Chase and Morgan Stanley, as well as U.S. Steel. But perhaps his most profound legacy is systemic. The sheer terror that one private citizen wielded so much unchecked power in 1907 led directly to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. The government basically realized they could never, ever again rely on a single man to act as a central bank. Which leaves us with this final question for you to consider. Was J.P. Morgan the vital architect of America's economic dominance, stepping up when the government simply couldn't? Or was he just a power-hungry titan using his inherited wealth to crush competitors and enrich himself? Whatever your view, there is absolutely no denying that the modern financial world was built in large part by his hands. Thank you for joining us on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the history behind the systems we use every single day.